Terry's Gardening and Prepping. My name is Teresa. I'd like to welcome you each on another adventure with me. Tonight is the Herb Society of Memphis's monthly meeting. The topic is going to be really good. It's, last I heard, it's supposed to be about propagating herbs and plants. I hope you enjoy going along with me, and I'll see you inside here in a little bit. Looking at the beautiful coleus and lantanas coming up the walkway. So beautiful. Oh, and curry trees, red hot pokers, looks like ginger, speckled milk bush. That's a new one. Let me get it closer. Look at its beautiful leaves. And it's called, where's the sign? Keep going. There we go. Speckled milk bush. And then they have shamrocks planted in amongst it. Beautiful purple, like elephant ears. Leaf of life. Calancho pinata. Interesting. Those are definitely different. Beautiful hydrangeas blooming. Oh, and the purple shamrocks, oxalis. Okay, time to head in. Beautiful planters. Devil's backbone. Madagascar palm. Oh, so pretty. Let's see what artwork is up. Oh, that's pretty. So pretty. Definitely interesting artwork. Oh, that's pretty. Oh, I love the bluebird box. That's pretty. Oh, wow, these are interesting. That's pretty. Let me get over here so you can see the whole picture. That's pretty. That one's neat. Oh, I like the pictures, the colors of that one.
I wanted to announce that our urban renewal grant was given to White Station Middle School Garden. I've seen it myself. They're doing an awesome job, and they're excited about getting the grant. Right now they're working on recycling the garden items, composting, and they're trying to figure out their water situation, which is a little problematic. It's on the hill behind the school, 100 or so feet from the spit. So, they are working hard. We have an event coming up next weekend through our garden gates. We will be at 5490 Walnut Grove Road. The event's from 9 to 4, so everybody should come out and visit. There's some amazing gardens on that tour, and it is free. In June, we have our small business showcase coming up. We have 15 participants. If you will check our Facebook page, we're spotlighting all the vendors every week, so you'll get an idea of what's going to be available. It's going to have an Alice theme, so feel free to join us in dressing up. We still do need volunteers for the hospitality committee. There's a list back there. You can sign up for what month you want to help. It'd be really nice if we had some extra people to help out with that task. They set up the food table, and we do have people that bring food as well. Any other announcements that I missed?
June the 5th, which is a Sunday, the Memphis Area Daylily Society will have daylilies for sale in the lobby. They support the daylily circle that's around the Alice.
Sweet.
The
Very good.
prices are wonderful. So Sunday the 5th, 12
Okay.
to 4.
Very good. Anybody else? I'm gonna let Miss Kathy introduce our speaker.
Good evening. It's a pleasure for me to have the honor to introduce tonight's speaker. Those of you who had the opportunity to read the newsletter of the Memphis Herb Society know that our speaker tonight, young though he may be, has had a lifelong love affair with plants and the varied environments in which they grow and thrive. It began in childhood with the gardens of his grandfathers. Then during college, he oversaw an urban farm. And then later, he worked with, this is a real interesting one to me, he went out to Oregon and worked with a cousin's medical cannabis operation. And then finally, here he is back in Memphis managing our greenhouse and here at the Botanical Garden. Like many of my fellow gardeners, I am in awe of someone with such passion for the intricacies of soil ecology and the rhizosphere of plants. That's not necessarily what I think of first when I'm worried with the garden, and maybe I should. His mantra is, don't cultivate plants, but instead cultivate an environment for plants. Horticulture Director Rick Pudwell is retiring this summer, and part of his legacy includes hiring a new generation of plant people like Tyler Taylor. As Rick says of Tyler, it is refreshing to see someone from the younger generation with lots of enthusiasm taking a thoughtful and realistic approach to growing plants. Tyler's knowledge and expertise will benefit all who work with him at the garden. And tonight, I look forward to being one of those beneficiaries as he shares his knowledge of the propagation of herbs with us. Please join with me to welcome Tyler Taylor to the
Can everybody hear me without the microphone?
Yes.
Okay, I'm not going to use this. It'll make me feel confined. Thank you for that introduction. That was very thoughtful. This is kind of a delayed talk that I'm having. This was supposed to happen, I think, in January, maybe. And then I succumbed to COVID after 2 years of cat and mouse with the disease. But I actually am really happy that it's happening right now, because this is kind of the time of the year when what we're going to be talking about is like optimal. So January would have been good, but I think you'll probably actually be able to apply a lot of this in hands-on in the next couple of months. A lot of you probably already have your gardens planted or are still lamenting that you haven't finished planting your garden in time. But I like to take a lot of the cuttings and stuff that I do off of new growth, because then I have the rest of the season to grow the plant out. Doing things in the wintertime is a little bit more tricky, and then a lot of times you'll get roots and then you just have a plant that sits there until now. So I like to do a lot of the propagation and stuff now. So I'm really glad that this is happening in May, well, almost June. But the other thing that I wanted to tell you guys is that you're lucky, because I'm probably going to be able to send you home with some plants, thanks to Sherry, who's not here. But when she knew that I was doing this talk, she went and cut a bunch of cuttings off of the basil that was in the herb garden and put it in the propagation house. And so it's mostly all rooted now, and she thought that y'all would be tickled to see it rooted in a big pile, and also that you can take it home. So it's good that it happened this time of the year. I guess propagation is really kind of the way any plant spreads. I'm going to stick to cuttings on this whole talk. I think everybody here, if you're a part of the Memphis Herb Society, you probably know how to dig up and divide a bulb. You probably also know how to plant seeds in the ground. Those would all be propagation. That's the way the plant propagates itself. I think what we're all mostly interested in is how to propagate plants from cuttings. So I don't want to narrow it to just that in calling it propagation, but that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. I'm going to have to do this manually. So you got to ask yourself a couple of questions when you're getting started, and I made this in January or December, so I might have to turn it and reference it as well. Do I have the proper environment is probably the most important question. Humidity is going to be your primary concern when you're rooting a cutting. So the house is usually not the ideal thing for that. Any of you that have house plants will know that if you have any that are tropical and they like super high humidity, the house is tough in the winter. So you end up having to put them in the bathroom or the kitchen. Kitchen because you open the dishwasher and the steam comes out, you're boiling water, and so the humidity tends to be a little bit higher in the kitchen. It also tends to be a little bit higher in the bathroom because you shower every day. I think the bathroom's best because it's smaller, and then if you shower every day or twice a day like I do working outside, then the humidity spikes more frequently and it takes a lot longer for it to dissipate. But if you don't have a greenhouse, you still have a house, and you probably have a bathroom and a kitchen. So that's your best bet on doing any kind of propagation at home. The other is like, what am I trying to propagate? I kind of view the propagation house here as a big laboratory. So I don't know everything about everything, but if it can be propagated, I can probably figure out how to propagate it from cuttings. Some of the stuff that I've had a tougher time with is woodier stuff. Sherry wanted me to propagate some bay laurel for her, and that's one of the few that I still haven't been able to propagate from cuttings yet. It took too long, and then it ended up just rotting. So woodier stuff tends to be more difficult, which is again why I like to do this at this time of the year, when I'm getting fresh, semi-woody green growth. That tends to be your best bet on woody stuff. You can propagate woody cuttings. It just tends to be more difficult. Woody would mean that it has kind of a bark on the exterior, which is designed to not allow things inside it. So that's going to make it a lot tougher to get roots out of it, and you're probably only going to get them out of the very tip at the end of the cutting where the exposed wound is. And then you have a plant that you're going to have to support until it roots out and can stand on its own. A trichome covered green stem would be something like this basil. Trichomes are really just the hairs on a plant. So this is the African blue basil that we have that Sherry took cuttings of. If it's covered in hairs, there's a pretty good bet that it propagates really easily from cuttings. You can probably just bury it in the dirt and it will probably root. Those trichomes that are on the stem will actually become the roots of the plant. I'm looking for a better example. Here's a better one. So you can see I've got roots coming all the way up past this branch. They're actually coming out of the top up here, and they're coming all the way down the stem. That's nice. This is two plants now. I'm going to cut it in half and make it into two. But a lot of times you get cuttings where you just get roots out of the bottom. That's not a bad thing, but it does take it longer for the plant to be able to support itself, and it's going to be a slower transition into its outdoor environment where you want it to be. So anything that's covered in trichomes, tomatoes, this Cuban oregano that I have right here is very hairy. Even the leaves are kind of velvety, but it has trichomes on the stem, little small hairs. These are actually already starting to come out a little bit, and that's what's going to turn into roots. Or you have things like a specific annual that just don't do well from cuttings. I actually learned all of that in the cannabis world, which is where I learned how to propagate things. But what we would do is we would grow a plant from seed. That would be our mother plant. We would let it flush out and have lots of growth on it, and then we would cut it back really hard. And we would take all those cuttings and we would make the field that we would plant out of that one plant, which is easy to do in the wintertime. It's easier to keep one plant than 1,000, and then take the cuttings right about early spring, root them, put them outside. Cannabis is an annual, regardless of its environment. There is no perennial cannabis. So it's actually from the equatorial regions in India and Southeast Asia. But it's designed, it's dioecious, there's a male and a female. It's designed to be pollinated, flower, drop seed, and come back the next year. So what I learned was that you have to start a new mother plant eventually. You could keep that plant from flowering, you can keep it under, grow lights and such, but every year that you're taking cuttings off that plant, that's an annual, that plant knows that it's 2,000 days old and that it's not doing its normal life cycle. And so the finished product that you would get off of the plant year after year would slowly start to degrade because that's not the nature of the plant to live indefinitely. So some things just don't do well from cuttings. A great example is petunias. They have a hairy stem. I took that rule that I just told you earlier and I was like, oh, petunias, I'm going to make 1,000 petunias off of this one hanging basket that I'm going to bring in the fall in the greenhouse. They rooted very quickly, like I thought they would, but then they just didn't do anything. And sometimes that's the nature of an annual. You can get the cutting to root, but from then on out, it's not going to become that full petunia hanging basket that you're looking for. It might make a couple of branches, a couple of flowers, but it's not going to get much bigger, and then it's just going to die, regardless of the level of care that you give it. So I think the first thing you need to focus on if you're going to try to make a propagation plan is to figure out what it is that you're rooting and the nature of the plant and see if it's something that is worth taking the time to do. Some stuff is just better from seed. Sherry is a big seed starter because she saves a lot of seed from her stuff. And if you want to really break it down, that's the most natural way of starting a plant. Most of them reproduce via seed. Where a lot of this came from is the fact that things can root naturally in nature in the soil. I've done a lot of landscape design and I've seen a lot of very poor mulching jobs where someone threw mulch around an azalea and the lower dangly branch that probably should have been trimmed off anyways was pushed down and was held under the mulch. And now it's a new plant. If you cut it off the base of that azalea, it's got roots. No one probably ever noticed that and it probably just stayed that way at that house, but I think that's probably where humans figured out that they could propagate things from cuttings is that it does occur naturally in nature. A lot of times if you ever grown ground tomatoes, it's a very common southern way to grow tomatoes, where the stem of the plant is touching the ground, that consistent moisture, those trichome hairs will turn into roots and then it'll continue to root along the ground. So I think that's probably where we got this idea from, but what you'll be amazed to find out is that a lot of the plants that you buy at the store are done this way. They're done from cuttings. Butterfly bushes, trees, all the new cherry trees that are out there on Cherry Road that are not very big were propagated off of branches off the others. I'm not saying that that's not a good thing, but knowing what we know about plants, knowing how old they are, that plant is as old as the old tree you took the cutting off of. The growth isn't as old, but genetically, it's the same tree. So I'll be curious to see how some of those younger trees look in 20 years if they make it to the size of the full adult cherry trees. A lot of times when you have a random plant that you bought at the store that 2 or 3 years later died, I think some of that could be due to the fact that everything's done from cuttings now because it's the easiest way to mass produce things for the public, which is actually getting a lot hungrier in the plant world. I don't know if it was from being stuck inside for 2 years or what, but that's going to be the starting point. Everybody's probably got these tools. You need clean scissors. I like 90% or higher rubbing alcohol just to be safe. And you want to sterilize your scissors as much as possible. I like to take a cup of alcohol and just leave my scissors in it. It'll eventually evaporate, but that's really just the best way, just to let them soak. It's not going to rust your scissors or anything like that. And the higher percentage alcohol you use, the less water that's in it. 10% that's in the 90% is water. So it's not going to rust your scissors if you have a higher percentage alcohol. I like having a plant with fresh new growth for the previously stated reasons. And then you're going to need some kind of media to root it in. The media is really just whatever the thing is. You're going to learn about this guy here, but also I have some other examples which I'm probably not going to pass around, but you all know what they are. This is peat. It's sphagnum peat moss. There's a confusion. They're all sphagnum moss. The stringy is this before it got broken down into this. So they're both sphagnum peat moss. I like to just call this one peat because it doesn't get confusing. The sphagnum, the stringy stuff that I use for orchids or whatever, it's the same thing. This is just the more broken down form of it. The plus side to this, this is what a lot of commercial plants are produced in. I don't like it, mainly because it becomes hydrophobic when it gets dry. Hydrophobic meaning afraid of water. Hydrophilic, loving water. When it's semi-moist like this, it absorbs water very readily. You've probably found this in potting soils that you've bought, where when it went dry, you watered it, and the water immediately ran out of the bottom of the pot. That's because once it becomes dry, it becomes hydrophobic. And so you actually have to give it like a superficial watering to re-moisten it, and then thoroughly water it so that it will saturate. Another reason that I'm not really big on peat is it's really environmentally unsound. It's like the most common media in potting soils. It's sold as peat moss in bales, but it's from dredging up peat bogs, which are huge carbon sinks. I mean, they're literally sequestering carbon from millions of years of plant growth in the bottom of a swamp, and then you're dredging all of that up, and it starts releasing methane and other things. It's really not good, and I think large scale, we're going to start seeing a lot less peat in things pretty soon. We're going to start switching to like cocoa coir, which is from coconut husk. It's more fibrous, and it's not quite as good at holding water, but there's better options than this. I like clay, not straight up clay, but you know, having some clay in your soil media helps it hold water. That's why clay is great in the South once everything's established, you know, and it's 4 weeks of no rain in July. A foot down, it's probably still tapping into some moisture. This right here is vermiculite and perlite. A lot of times, whenever you're reading about something on the internet, it'll say vermiculite and perlite. I just go ahead and mix it together because I don't know why I would ever use either one by itself. The darker thing that you're seeing in here is the vermiculite, maybe a little bit of soil that probably got sprinkled in. But vermiculite actually has a lot of trace minerals, so a lot of the iron, magnesium, metals that are used in smaller quantities for the plant, a lot of those are in vermiculite. And then the perlite is actually like a volcanic glass. I'm not big on perlite because it floats. The whole reason you want it is for drainage in your soil. So if you flood a pot and it all comes to the top, then your drainage is really at the top and it's less at the bottom. And over time, it works its way back up. So it's really not the best thing. We use some stuff that I didn't really know about until I started working here called turface. You can buy it as a variety of things. There's a Tennessee company that makes it called Mule Mix. It's kiln-fired clay shards from pottery kilns. Things that explode, broken pieces, they get ground down into shards about the size of perlite. It never rehydrates because it's been kiln fired, so it's going to stay like a pebble. And it actually starts to sink down into the soil over time, which is really what you're going for if you're looking for drainage. Another thing I've rated some things in, or a mixture of these, is soil conditioner. This is evergreen soil conditioner. We add it to a lot of our soil mixes for decreased drainage and porosity. It also will be long-term compost. This is fine bark shavings of pine. If you've ever gotten pine bark nuggets, this is a smaller form of that. It's just more like a cereal flake almost. And it holds moisture pretty decently because it's woody, but it also drains really well. Sometimes I do mixtures of these two. Sometimes I do mixtures of these two. But I don't really do a whole lot in just this, but it is good to have. It's really cheap. You can get a bag of it at Home Depot for like $2.
What did you call it?
It's evergreen soil conditioner. It'll be a white bag with an orange label, and it's got some pine trees in the background. Just like the cheap topsoil bags that they sell, the same company makes that. And then this is Jolly Gardener. This is the Pro Mix. Well, it's a Pro Gardening Mix, I guess you would call it. It's not really a true Pro Mix. But this looks like potting soil, because it is, but it's nutrient inert. So there's no nutrition in this. This is just a combination of peat, fine pine bark, vermiculite and perlite, and probably a little bit of aged forest products. Long term, you might be able to get some nutrition from this, but the reason I like this is if I have a bag of this that's dry, it's sterile. And so then I can root something in dirt, but I'm not worried about the cutting or rotting because it's sterile. These can go funky if the bag stays wet and it becomes anaerobic and smells like rot. So I like to use it if I'm rooting it, I like to get a dry bag and then hydrate it and do cuttings in it. So those are the 4 media that I brought. The other obvious one is water. A lot of you have probably rooted stuff in a vase on your kitchen windowsill. I still do a lot of the stuff that way. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So one of the ones I brought here is a Ficus lyrata. It's a really expensive house plant. This rooted in water. I took this cutting like 2 weeks ago. It's just starting to root. There's the white clusters on here. I brought this as an example of what root formation starts to look like on something that we would classify as woody. I know this isn't really an herb, but this is my best physical representation. And y'all are more than welcome to play with some of this at the end. Yes, sir.
Have you ever, so like, you propagate it until there's like very itty, like white specks that are gonna become like you just showed?
Yep.
And then have you ever finished propagating them in the soil? That's what we usually do.
Yeah, a lot of times if I get something like this, there's 2 of these in a pot on a misting table in the propagation house. I kept this one out to show you. A lot of times when I get them about like this, while they're wet, I will take them and I will dip them
That's what we do.
again in this rooting powder. It likes to adhere to things when it's wet, which is nice. And then I will plant it in the soil, and then I'll put it back on the misting table. And it will continue rooting because it's already on its way. And a lot of times too, it will be slower now in here for this to develop into roots because it's not dark. Roots occur underground, so they like it cool and dark. That's a tricky situation with a plant because the plant needs light to be alive. So a lot of times if you have this, the ideal is something that's opaque so that light does not come through it, like a plastic vase. It's not that it won't root in here, but once it gets to this point, it actually is going to be slower for it to root in here than it would be in soil like you're talking about. So usually when I get it to this point, I will put it in soil.
We just, we take it, put it in the rooting powder. We usually wait maybe until it has the white specks, put the rooting powder on it, then put it in the soil, and then just maybe in a couple of years just go plant it out.
Yep, you can absolutely do that. And I do that with a lot of the stuff that I have. So I have this as a kind of a step-by-step. Again, I want to clarify, if there's anything that I've learned in the horticulture community, there is no the way. This is just my way that I do it. Some people have been doing stuff for 30 years and they like that way, then that's the way you should do it. I like to take healthy top cuttings, one, because that's where you get that new growth that's semi-woody or green. This is an example of one of the things that I actually mentioned earlier. I didn't actually say it, but it was in the list. This is a pelargonium, which is an African scented geranium. You'll see it's sold as a mosquito plant a lot, or a citronella plant. It's a scented geranium. It does not act as passive defense, by the way, for mosquitoes. I always tell people that. You can't just plant a perimeter of them around your patio and not get bit. You have to tear the leaves off, get the oil out, and rub it on you. A lot of people get really dismayed when they learn that, but that's just not how that plant works. You can take a lot of foliage off of that and grind it up and steep it in water, and then spray it on yourself, spray it on your plants. You can use it, but it's not a passive defense. This plant is an African scented geranium, so it's from a semi-mesic, semi-xeric environment. It's got a wet season and a dry season, but overall this plant, if you read it on the tag, it'll say well-draining soil. This one is easy to rot, especially in the wintertime. It gets woody. It becomes kind of shrub-like. The one that's in Sherry's garden is where these cuttings came from. It was one somebody gave me in the fall last year. I must have made probably 300 off of it over the winter, but as it got older, the growth started getting more mature on it, and it started to get actually kind of woody. I never knew they got that way. I never had one for that long. I always put it outside for the season and then let winter take its course. But I like to take the cutting from the top part. That's a cannabis carryover. Because if I do 100 of them, I don't want to have to prune them all differently. I want them all to grow the same way. So I'm going to get the same apical growth that I was getting out of that top stem. And then if I want to top them all to make them branch, I'm going to snip the same cut on all of them because they're all identical. Top growth is not the best to root because it's the furthest away from the roots. Lower cuttings actually root easier because there's a higher concentration of the hormones to the base of the plant. Same way like the azalea I'm talking about earlier, that branch that's on the bottom that somebody threw mulch on, it was closer to the base of the plant. That's why it rooted so easily without anybody helping it. It just needed to be covered up. So if you're trying to get a successful root, taking lower growth can be better. If I'm making a bunch of things like for gardens or the plant sale or whatever, I like to do them all the same. Yes, sir.
So it's basically that tub right there and the water basically do the same thing.
You're one slide ahead of me, so you're just gonna have to wait. Okay. But I appreciate the reason. So this is actually not even a true top cut either. I don't know if you can tell. This right here is it's a second cut. The top cut was above that. Here you have a wound. You have a wound here. I also like to take it with multiple petiole connections, meaning like where the leaf attaches to the stem. You got one here. There's probably one just up under that thumb disc. But that tends to be where roots will come out of because that tends to be where your rooting hormone gets absorbed through. Mm-hmm. It's not just going to go through the skin of the plant. A lot of times if you put it in rooting powder, you still only get roots out of the bottom because it's taking that up in through the wound. So if you have multiple wounds below the surface, the roots that will come out of here will come out of the bottom. I'm sorry if I'm blocking this. They'll come out of the bottom, they'll come out of here, and they'll come out of here. I might have one or two like horns that are starting to come out elsewhere, but the most root growth that I'm going to get is out of those open wounds. And again, yeah, this is another cannabis carryover. If this is called cloning, for whatever reason in the cannabis world, they call it cloning. I don't know why. Your rooting cuttings, it is kind of a clone because it's genetically identical. But if we're cloning, I want to clone strong genetics. So I don't want to clone off of a sick, diseased, weak, dead plant. Every now and then you might have something that's sentimental, that's like on the verge of dying or something, and you really want to desperately save it. You can root that, but you're just rooting weaker genetics. So that's always a good point to remember. I like to do this in the spring for the fresh green growth, but it's usually when everything's looking great. It's not August when I slipped up on watering for a week and things are starting to kind of take that turn. This is what I want. I want it when it's at its healthiest. That's when it's going to be the best for me to get roots, and I want to clone a healthy plant. So the various media I've got, water is the first one. You'll always read about rooting in water to keep the water clean, right? You got to keep the water clean, and then they'll tell you got to change it every 24 to 48 hours. If you keep the water clean, that second part is not true. Water loses oxygen, and it becomes anaerobic, which is what's going to lead to rot. So a lot of times what I'll do, if I have various vases, pretend that this is water that I didn't just take from here. At my house, my wife will tell you, I have stuff rooting on the kitchen windowsill that I don't even need to be propagating. It's just something that I trimmed off of a plant, and I was like, well, I'll give it to somebody as a gift or something. Every now and then I go, and I add water to it. I made a little bit of bubbles. I added fresh water that had oxygen. So I just re-oxygenated that. So that bought me another 48 hours. You can just add a little bit more in a couple of days. That's if you're keeping the water clean. If not, then you can still start to have biofilm and certain negative bacteria in there that will start rotting this cutting. But the changing the water religiously 24 to 48 hours, a lot of people, they kind of roll their eyes at that. They're like, oh, I'd have to keep up with it or whatever. Well, you really don't. You just have to add more water to it because eventually that water is going to lose its oxygen. It's very analog and it requires consistency and diligence. And not everything is conducive to water propagation. A great example would be something that is like a cactus or something that's from a very dry environment that says it must have well-draining soil and it's easy to rot. That thing probably doesn't want to sit in water because that's not what it's accustomed to. That would be something that I would for sure put in vermiculite and perlite and then try to root it in that. The other one is what this young gentleman was just asking about. They call this brand is Easy Clone, which is really kind of lame, but they're way overpriced for what it is. It's a big plastic tub, and there's a pump in there that has little misters, and they just spray. I don't have to change the water in this because it's circulating like your fish tank, so it's staying oxygenated. All I have to do is keep this water clean, which can be a problematic thing sometimes, but you'll see various things that I have where I scraped the scum off before I brought it in here. This I really like because it's set it and forget it. It's like, I don't have to worry about this plant. Great example, I've got something in here I know for sure that's been rooted for a while. This is one. This is the Ficus religiosa, or the Bodhi tree, but now it's growing hydroponically. The only problem with that is there's no nutrients in here. So if you had something in here that I didn't have the time to really pot up just yet, I can add a little bit of liquid nutrients to the water, and then it'll keep growing. I like that better than this, because if you root something in one of these medias, once it roots, now it wants to grow, and it's hungry. It's not a seedling, it's a mature plant that you rooted, so it wants to feed right away. There's nothing in here. So now I'm pressed to pot it up in soil. If I don't have the time to do that, then I have a window where I just lost my rooted cutting. This has probably been in here for 3 weeks with roots. It probably got roots in about a week, but it looks pretty good still. It's growing slower, but that's why I like this, is because I could go out of town. I leave every weekend. I don't live here, and everything's fine when I come back in on Monday, and I really like that. Over time, these plants are using the water. The more plants you have in here, the more rooted they are, your water levels will eventually start to drop, so you do have to kind of check that periodically. And a great way to do that is to just unplug it. So now it's quiet, quit running, and then I'll show you the bottom. I cleaned the bottom of the reservoir, but I thought it would be more authentic to show you the dirty top, because this is what it looks like if you don't clean it. And I got some rooted stuff in here, but you also see I got biofilm growing on the bottom. I tend to add rooting powder to the water periodically, which helps keep things from rotting. But I got to clean this now, which was one of the reasons I brought it over here, because I moved it already. I'm going to drain the water and move it back, and then I'll probably just clean it. What's great about this, though, is I can take all of these individual cells out, I can drop them in a bucket of water, and then I can go clean this, and then I can take those and put them back in, which is really nice. If it ever, for whatever reason, runs out of water, you will burn that pump up just like any other pond pump, so you kind of want to keep the water going. But they make these all the way down to a 24 count size, so it's great for your house with a little small bucket. I've seen a lot of really cool DIY ones where you can take a Rubbermaid bin and you buy these foam cells, which are still great for using if you're using a base of water, because it keeps the leaves from getting down in the water. This was like $2 for a pack of these. And they're called cloning collars, in case anyone wants to look this up. But I'll take these, and I'll have to clean these because they tend to get kind of grody. It kind of smells like a fish tank, and it's just algae. It's really all it is, and that's from me adding the liquid nutrients to the water. But
what did you call the little, those?
Collars, like your shirt collar.
Okay,
It's a
but
cloning collar.
what brand?
Ooh, this is an off-brand that I bought off of
I just
Amazon.
need to know where I can get it and.
Google.
You can get it on Amazon, and if you type in cloning collars, you'll probably see this one pop up, because that's what I did a couple weeks ago when I bought replacements. And these were cheaper, and they all work the same. They're the same size. But if you take this cloning collar, you buy these, and you have a Rubbermaid bin, then you use this to trace your circles on the lid. Cut the holes out, buy a cheap fountain pump so your water is circulating, and you have to have some kind of little mister attachment on it. But I've seen a lot of really cool cheap DIY ones that were probably made for $30. Then this was like $3.75 for this big one. This is the biggest one. It's 128 count. They go down to 12 or 24, I think. And sometimes they come with a special attachment that fits over the top, and it's a humidity dome. That is unnecessary for me because I'm in a greenhouse. So my greenhouse is my humidity dome. These are pretty cool. Most people that see this, they get really interested in it because they've never seen one before. This is kind of like run-of-the-mill on, definitely on cannabis reproduction, but on a lot of plants that don't like to be wet, like this rosemary, for example, it doesn't want to be on the misting table, getting misted every 20 minutes. Then these leaves start rotting. Even if it is rooting, these are going to rot because this wants to be a little on the drier side. So that's what's great about this, is that the foliage stays dry. The bottom tip of the cutting is what's getting misted. I put these in probably 2 or 3 days ago, but they're not rooted yet, but they're wet. Every now and then you might get a dry spot. If I leave something rooted for too long and the roots get really long, it'll suck them into the pump, and then it'll block one of the misters. So then this corner, I might come in the next day and they're all laid over. You still probably have some time to fix them after that, but these are pretty great because they're set it and forget it. And also, again, because you can keep growing the plant in here once it's made roots. And then your substrate was, the various media that I was showing you before. The substrate for me that I like to use is typically vermiculite and perlite with the peat added in a 1:1:1 ratio. So an even mixture of the three. The peat is the best because it holds a little bit of water better than the vermiculite or perlite, but it's also just kind of closer to soil. Like if we're thinking of this as something that plants naturally do, you want to kind of mimic the natural process, and they don't typically root in like rocky, gravelly mixtures. So I like to add a little bit of peat or the soil conditioner just to make sure that that it still holds a little bit of water and also doesn't have a whole lot of air pockets. Problem with this for you guys at home is that you probably don't have a misting table. Ours mists like every 20 minutes. I think I adjusted it when I started working here because it was like every 3 minutes and the ground was slimy under the table. But it's also a lot of water that's used. But the misting table is nice because it actually makes that whole greenhouse humid. In the wintertime, when it's not letting in cold air and it's sealed off, it builds up to 99% humidity in there, and it's kind of suffocating. If you've got glasses, they're going to fog up. They're probably going to stay fogged up, the whole time you're in there. Now it's not quite that way because it's ventilating to stay cool, so it's about whatever the humidity is outside. So if it's a rainy day, it's 80 or 90% in there, but it's usually about 40 to 60. What a lot of people, if you've ever done any research on propagating stuff, you've probably seen somebody say something about putting a Ziploc bag over the top of the cup or something like that. That's your greenhouse. That's your humidity dome. I don't like Ziploc bags because they tend to fall in and then they're touching my leaf, and then there's condensation in between there, and that's just where stuff starts to rot. You start to get botrytis or powdery mildew or something, and it'll just start to rot. I like it to be in a humid environment but not to be touching. So if you want to just, make it a little more classy, you can use this guy. I root a lot of stuff in my backyard with milk jugs, tops of Gatorade bottles. There's a lot of plastic floating around these days, so it's not hard to find this. The reason I like this too is because I can tell how humid it is by the condensation in it. So if it's completely covered in condensation and I can't see inside it, that's probably a little bit too much moisture and it's probably going to rot. So then you can just poke a hole in the top. Or if it's the top of the Gatorade bottle, you just unscrew the cap a little bit. I take these all the time, and I will take a hydrangea cutting in the spring when it's nice and semi-woody. I'll put it in rooting powder. I will stick it in a pot of soil, and then I will take the top of a milk jug, and I will put it on top of it. And I'll put it in a shady place. And then when that milk jug is lifted up off the soil because the plant is pushing up on it, I know it's rooted. So this is really the best thing, I think. and then you can reuse them. So it's really good to use as your humidity dome. Yes, sir.
So the Gatorade waters. So you know those water bottles, and they just sort of come in the teepee type.
It has like the little nipple on the top.
Yeah. Could you cut that off and use it, and
Yeah. That would be your vent hood, essentially. That top nipple that you're talking about that has the curved spout. You always wanted to have some kind of ventilation. If you get trays like this, they sell rooting trays or whatever, and it has a bunch of circles, probably about the size of these cloning collars that have peat in them, and then it comes with a clear plastic dome on the top.
Yeah.
There's always vents on the side, and you would always want those to be open to some degree, because then it will be too moist in here, and things will rot, almost guaranteed. Unless it happens to be something that's just one of your really humidity finicky house plants that you have. The reason that you need that humidity dome is because the environment thing, like I was talking about in the beginning, humidity is really the most important factor in all of this. Without roots, the plant can't take in water or nutrients. So what happens is, it's kind of like the way we sweat. It's called transpiration. You probably learned about it in 5th grade science. You probably forgot it, just like I did. Then you probably learned it later when you wanted the information. But transpiration is basically the plant sweating. And a fun fact, like only 90-something% of the water that the plant takes up, like only 5 or 6% of that actually gets used by the plant. The rest of it is released through transpiration, through the leaves. That might sound counterintuitive to us of like, well, why was it taking up all that water just to lose it? That's actually how the plant takes things up. Transpiration, when the water leaves through the leaves, creates a vacuum in the stem, which causes suction. It's literally how the plant sucks things up is by losing them through the top. It's also how you have a terrarium. The humidity stays in that terrarium, and then the water that you put in there is like the same water that's always in there. Because the plant takes it up, releases it through its leaves, it stays in the terrarium, falls back down, and it's just a closed loop cycle.
and you'd have clean water.
And you would have clean water, yes. The plants will keep that water clean. The reason that is important in rooting a cutting is if you take a cutting and you put it in soil with powder and the soil's wet, it won't be very long before that cutting is still drooping. It doesn't matter if the soil's wet. It's because it's losing water through the top. And then just because of the fact that it's sitting in that wet soil, it's not necessarily enough water for the plant to take up, which is why people do it in a vase, because it's sitting in water. So it's losing water through the top, it's sucking it right up through the stem by losing it through the top. That's just going to happen because that's the natural process of plants. So that's why the humidity dome is crucial. If you have a humidity dome and it's got condensation, then the plant is losing it, but it's all staying in that closed loop cycle, and the plant can take in moisture through osmosis on the leaves. So if it's humid in the air, like a humidity that you or I would not want in our house or even our bathroom or kitchen, it can take that moisture back in through the leaves, which is just buying it time to change hormonally and create roots. So humidity is always going to be the most important factor, regardless of what environment that plant comes from. The cacti and stuff that we root in here, we cut them up, we let them callus over, and they sit in a pile, in the greenhouse. But the reason that they all can do that is because the greenhouse is humid. So even though that cactus wants to live in a 20 or 30% relative humidity environment, in the greenhouse it's perfect for rooting them because it can still take in that moisture through the air. So humidity will always be your most important factor. If you have one of these, not so much. But if you're rooting something in a media, which is what most people will be doing, the best thing to do is cover it with something. I've seen people do multiples of them in a Rubbermaid bin, and then they put the lid on it. That was their humidity dome. And then you just monitor that condensation. If it's completely coated, you might want to let it breathe a little bit, and then put the lid back on. greenhouse, humidity domes, already covered that. Oh yes, another important part. So just like us with sweating, higher heat is going to actually make transpiration happen faster, right? Your plant drinks more in the summer when it's 105 degrees. It's because it's losing more water to take up more water so that it makes sure that it's got constant access to it. So in higher temperatures, it's going to be a little bit tougher to root stuff. That's why I like to do it in the shade or something in my backyard. At the same time, too low of a temperature is not ideal for rooting things either. There's a reason you put a heat mat under your seed trays in February, because you do need it to be at a certain temperature, but the later you drag this on into the summer, if you're trying to just like do this outside in the shade, the higher the temperature, the greater the need for humidity control, because the plant is going to lose way more water through transpiration. But I used to do all of this in the spring to just make cheap money on landscape design. I would go cut all my hydrangeas at my house with all their fresh new green growth. I'd put them in a pot, put a dome over the top, set it in the shade. Well, once that was lifted up, I had a hydrangea. And then I had the rest of the year to make that one stem into a semi-decent shrub. And so I would do all of that to like have a plant sale at my house, or I would go plant, something on somebody's property and charge them for the plant, but I didn't have to go buy it, retail and then plant it on their property. The other reason that this is great is because a lot of us, if we're balling on a budget, I might really like this plant, but it's $60, and I don't want to buy 4 of them, but I really want 4 of them for wherever I'm going to put it. So I get 1, and then I'll make 3 more. A lot of times too, this is something that, I've butted heads with various botanists about, but I like to take big cuttings sometimes so that it looks more like the nature of the plant quicker. So this is like an abutilon. It's a flowering maple. It looks like a maple tree with the leaves, but it's got like a lucky lantern kind of a flower that hangs off of it. It's actually in the hibiscus family, but this is a really long cutting because it has really long branches, but it's sold in tree form. So that's why I did it like this, because I didn't want to wait an extra 4 months for it to look like a tree. So same thing with like a butterfly bush or a hydrangea. As long as you're sticking with the semi-green, fresh new woody growth, you can take a bigger branch that's already got 2 or 3 branches coming out of it, and you can root that. You'll just need to have something bigger to put over the top of it. And then it'll look more like the hydrangea that you're looking for if you're trying to make new plants. The other good thing that this is for is like, if you want to make an herb garden and you bought 1 of each thing, and then by this time you're realizing that you actually have a little bit of space left and you want to fill it in, if you've been propagating plants, you've already got the same plants that you bought and you can put them in the garden. Or when you got somebody at your house who's lusting over your garden, you could say, hey, I've got these, and you can take them home. One becomes many all the time. So, I take a cutting off, like my wife is here, she'll tell you. We went to a family trip in, where was it? Little Red River, I think it was. We stayed at a cabin, and there was this viburnum in the backyard that was just like gorgeous. And it was one that we had bought here and sold at the nursery, and I was seeing it in its mature form, and that's what made me fall in love with it. And so I took cuttings, and I wrapped them in a moist paper towel, and I put them in a Ziploc bag, and I brought them back here, and then I rooted them in the greenhouse. But I think if you're doing it on someone's property, you should probably ask for permission first. But I see plants all the time when I'm walking around. If no one was looking, I'd probably take a snip off of it, just because I knew that I could probably root it, and then I didn't have to buy the plant. The only real reason there's a monopoly on plants is because other people know how to do this, and then we go buy their plants from them.
So could you take, have you ever took like flowers and tried to propagate them? Can you do that?
No, and I'm not going to say that you can't, because there's too many nuances in the plant world for me to say that with any kind of certainty. But I will tell you that like all these lantana cuttings that are right here on this side, I cut the flowers off of them, because root development happens the highest at the youngest stage of the plant. And so hormonally, I'm trying to get the plant to go back to that. Just like you're at a different stage developmentally than I am, I'm trying to make an adult go back to a kid. So if the adult is the flower, then I want the flower to be gone. And I don't want it to focus its energy on maintaining that flower or keeping it pretty or further development of it. And if it's got buds on here that haven't opened yet, I don't want it wasting its time trying to get them to open. I'm going to cut those off.
You want it to waste its time on doing the
Exactly.
development.
And so the most important part is kind of like where you take that cut. A lot of times you'll see people say, you know, take it at that point where the petiole is coming out, where you have, it'll be a little bit more dense on the stem. They'll tell you that that should be at the bottom, which is usually true. You should keep that at the bottom, but I like to have multiples in between. But the reason that that is because at those areas of the stem, there's the highest concentration of undifferentiated plant cells. That sounds really complex, but all that means is there's cells there that the plant hasn't determined what they're going to be yet. In the stem part, it's hollow. I mean, that's how water comes up through it through transpiration. Most of what's in there plant cell wise has been designated a task and it has a differentiation. And so it's going to be harder for the plant to hormonally change that into something else. But if it's got undifferentiated plant cells, think of them like stem cells. They don't have a purpose yet, but the plant's actively growing and it's going to use them for things. Now you have the plant go, oh no, I got to make roots. It's going to make those cells into roots first, always. That's just all it can do. You can give it rooting hormone and all that kind of stuff, but what it's going to do is hormonally change other cells into other cells. So the best thing to have are plant cells that haven't been given a purpose yet. And that's usually concentrated at those petiole connections because then they're transported up like kind of in between. It'll be more dense. If you feel the plant, where the leaf was connected to it, it kind of comes out a little bit, almost like the top of your femur bone. That density is where things are held and then they're moved up higher. And then they're held there and they're moved up higher. It's just like moving up a chain. So you always want to start with that. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've taken cuttings with volunteers and we've like butchered a plant. And there'll be a couple that don't have a petiole connection like that, where it's just the hollow stem cut off at a 45. Guarantee you, a week later, those are the only ones that don't have roots yet. That's not to say that they won't ever get them, but if you're trying to do it fast, that's not the way to do it. So it's a good question.
Is there a formula for how long it takes?
No.
All right, and does it matter if it's large, it takes longer, and small, it takes less time? Is there a...
Not necessarily.
I'm not going to say that for sure, because I'm not really sure that I
you're
could
just
give you a
supposed to look
certain
at it and know
answer.
when it's ready?
Well, what do you mean by ready? Like when it has roots?
Well, when it's ready to move from here, is there a place where it starts rotting, where you just got to catch it and move it to its next environment?
For me, so there is kind of a timeline. We used to have a timeline that we shot for when I was out in Oregon, but it was because we were propagating all of the same plant. It's the same plant, just a bunch of different cultivars of it essentially. So 7 to 10 days was what we were shooting for in the cannabis industry. That's kind of what I shoot for on a lot of this stuff. These lantana, I did last week. They've got roots. Again, it came out of the bottom. This one was more woody. These were from Jill in the pollinator garden. She has lantana trees. They're trees because she brings them in the greenhouse every winter. And I told her that if she's going to put them in my greenhouse, she's going to have to be okay with me cutting on them. So, cut on them. But this top part that's up here would have rooted all the way down the stem because it was hairy. Towards this bottom, it didn't have trichomes on it anymore. It was starting to be kind of woody like lantana can be. And so that's why you've got roots out of the bottom. But it's still rooted really quickly. So I kind of just have that in my head now
So
where
you're ready to put
lantana
that in
roots
the
fast.
ground then?
Absolutely.
And so how far up would you bury it?
I actually still have some hairs up here.
Do you go all
So
the
I'd
way?
probably bury it all the way up to
Yeah.
there. It's not going to rot it. Now, if this were like this, which is Harry Lauder's walking stick, this is the curly Q stuff they put in flower arrangements, and it's about to root. It's taken a while. It's got little bumps on it, And if y'all want, y'all can just like pass it around. This was an experiment. You can see the bumps at the bottom starting to form. It's also got biofilm on it, so you know, it's kind of like half starting to rot. It may or may not make it. But that's been in there for almost a month now, and I'm probably about to give up on it. So that's kind of like where I go. It flushed leaves, you can see, and then they died. It might flush them again, and that would be when I would think that it's probably still okay. But if it doesn't do anything else, it's probably done, and I'll probably just throw it away. If it gets the white nodules like we were talking about earlier, that's usually when I go ahead and put it in soil. But again, you'll still need a humidity dump because it doesn't have roots yet. It's starting to form roots, but it doesn't have them yet. So you can go ahead and put it in dirt, but I would still cover it because it's going to have to continue that root development before it can drink, essentially. That's a good question. I'm not sure that there really is a timeline per se. The rule I like to follow is fast, because the longer that it takes, the worse it looks. You know, like the longer this would take to root, it would get crispy, and then I'd have to wait for new growth to come back out. And like, the longer it takes, the more detrimental it is to this cutting. So I like to try to do it as fast as possible. I like having a variety of media in the greenhouse because I'll do rosemary in here, I'll do rosemary and vermiculite and perlite on the misting table, and then I'll do them like in a different media. And then I'll be like, oh, hey, it rooted way faster on the misting table. That's how I'm going to do them from now on. Some things do faster in here, and so I just do them in here that way. That's a good question. I really need to start kind of taking better tabs of the information for all the different plants that I've been propagating, because some of them just take too long. And I think after a while, the plant just kind of gives up. I mean, it's a living thing, and it can only sustain itself in that way for so long. And so usually the crispy leaves is my indicator. These are the other Harry Lauder's walking stick. These are the crispy leaves. So it didn't have foliage when I put it in there. And then it put out leaves, and I got really excited. And I started seeing bumps on the bottom. And then I didn't clean my water, and it got biofilm on it, which is why those bumps are not white, they're green. And I think the biofilm kind of stopped that, and so now it's just in the stages of rot. But I just went by the fact that it pushed out growth where it otherwise didn't have any. These Japanese maples right here, I got one in this example. And I think to answer your other question, I think you can almost kind of get roots faster from not necessarily a big cutting, but a larger cutting. So this was my experiment. Our new boss had a bunch of Japanese maples that were at his property from his landscape design. And he was like, man, they look terrible. I understand if you don't want them. And I was like, no, I know exactly what to do with them. So I cut them back pretty hard, and I tied some of the branches down to kind of get that sprawl that everybody likes. And a lot of the stuff that I cut off, that was the type of growth that I like to try to root. I took cuttings of it because I hadn't rooted Japanese maples yet. So I was like, hey, let's see how it does. This one has more of the shape of the Japanese maple tree that I'm looking for, right? It's already got 6 branches on it, I think, and a main fork, which usually is what they have. They have that nice even split. This one is smaller and weaker. And y'all can pass these around if you want. They had the same thing, okay? This was in here. And to be perfectly honest, for 5 days it was in a cup of water with all of them crammed in there, and I didn't change the water out. And then I remembered that I had those cuttings, and I put it in here. But the development that you see on this one happened in that cup of water with all of them packed in there. But this smaller one doesn't have really anything going on yet. This larger one, you're starting to get the white nodules right there. So I think maybe it could be like, I know I'm anthropomorphizing plants, but it might be kind of like a panic thing, you know? The larger thing needs more to stay alive, so maybe hormonally it changes and makes roots faster. But all the small cuttings don't have any root development on them yet. And all the bigger cuttings that I did have root development on them. So if I were going to give you my swag, which is like a scientific guess, it's a wild guess, I would say that probably a little bit larger might actually help you out a little bit, just because it needs more to keep going. It's a panic button. The plant is going, hey, stop. What we were doing, we're going to have to change that now. And we're going to have to revert hormonally back to development. There are natural plant hormones. This is where I can kind of go off on a tangent. My wife likes to call me the fire hydrant, because when people like him ask me good questions, will look at her at a party and it's like, I don't want to say this, but I'm about to splurge information for an hour. We're never going to be out to leave the church lobby. Not that we go to church, but my dad was a minister and it was always hard to get him out of the church lobby. So in the same type of thing, if you ask me a plant question, if it's a good one like this guy's got, I'm probably going to splurge a lot of info. So I'll go on that tangent after I answer his question.
So you basically want, when you are doing cuttings, you want a small version of the tree or of the plant.
I'm not sure I can give you that wide ranging of an answer, because that was for a tree. So maybe for this lantana, I'm not as worried about it, because I'm not really trying to get it to be a tree. No matter how leggy of a lantana you've got, if I put this in the ground, by the end of the summer, it's going to be 3 feet wide and 3 feet tall, regardless of how I prune it. It's just how quickly you want it to look good in your landscape. That's when you want to start pruning this early to make it look that way. But this tree is a little bit different, you know what I mean? So it's got to take a while to grow up and get into that tree form, and it's got to be pruned by somebody to get that pleasing shape that we're looking for.
So when you plant it and you want it to look like an actual tree, then you got to start pruning it when it's
I wouldn't say you've got to, but it's wise to do that. Otherwise, the plant is going to put out growth, and then to lose that growth, it has to slowly die. So when you see trees around here that have a lower branch that's dead, that's how the tree gets rid of the branch. It doesn't have any other way of doing it. So it's better for you to cut off that lower branch so that it's not just an open, rotting wound on the tree that makes it more susceptible to disease. So it needs you to cut on it, but it doesn't need you. I mean, it can lose that branch. It's just going to take longer, and then it might not be the best way.
So it would be wise to just keep your plants in shape.
Yeah, sure. And for me, it's if I'm selling it, people want it to look a certain way when they buy it. If it's going out on the grounds, there's a certain level of look that it has to have before we put it out there, because we're not going to just be well, it'll figure it out in a month or two. We want it to look good when we put it out on display. So that's my rule that I follow, because that's what was instilled on me, is to try to get it to look whatever the market quality is. This might be a good example too. So sometimes they just don't make it. I always shoot for the stuff that roots easy to have a 90-95% success rate. But lantana's really easy. Sherry's over there on the voice call. She'll tell you, lantana's really easy to root. And they sell it by the thousands commercially. But this one just didn't make it. I don't know why. Could have been because my water was dirty. It was kind of a weak cut. But it's losing its leaves. It doesn't have roots. This one does. They were all done at the same time. So another good rule to follow is to not just take one. I did 4 Harry Lauder's walking stick, 5 if you count the one I passed around, because I thought that it probably wasn't gonna root. So I took at least 5 just in case, because if the one failed, that wouldn't have really told me if I could root that or not. You know what I mean? Because this lantana died, and if this is the only one that I took, I'd have been well, can't root lantana cuttings, So I always try to take more than one, if possible. And I'm not sure that there's any roots or any herbs that would be rooted this way. I'm sure there are, especially knowing what all is considered an herb these days. But you can also do things from leaf cuttings. So this is a watermelon peperomia. They get sold as houseplants a lot. Or they call it a watermelon begonia. It's not a begonia, it's peperomia. And it's only because it looks like a watermelon, I guess, that they call it that. But this is the leaf, and I got it at the petiole where it was attached, because that's where the roots come out of. But this will become a plant. I just have to plant it the proper way. If I left this in water, the new plant growth is going to come from right here, where those roots came out of, because that's the highest concentration of undifferentiated plant cells. That's where your new growth is. It's not going to make the new plant from up here or on the top of the leaf. It's going to be from right there, wherever the roots came out of. So when I plant this in the soil, I'm going to plant it in a pot, and if you came into the greenhouse, you probably wouldn't even notice it. You'd probably be like, oh, that plant's dead. But I would set it like that, so that, and I would make sure that those roots were just lightly covered, because my new growth is going to come out of right there. So I want it to be close to the surface. And then, as soon as I get new growth, I'm going to cut this one off, because it's going to look oddball for a while. I'm sure there are some herbs that would be propagated from leaf cuttings. This is never my preferred method, but sometimes it's the only one, like for this plant. This plant doesn't make stems. It just shoots out a bunch of leaves kind of from the ground. So to make 100 of them, I got to take 100 leaf cuttings. That's probably the only way to do it. And the reason that I'm doing it now is because it takes a long time for a leaf cutting to look the way you want it to look. Because I can't prune this to make this look like the plant. I've just got to wait. And so the best thing is, if you're doing leaf cuttings, is to give yourself more time, because it's going to take about twice as long probably for it to look like a plant. So I have like 500 of these that I took because I wanted to be able to sell them next spring. It's going to take that long for me to fill one of these pots with this plant, with all those leaves. It'll be between now and next March that plant will look like something. So I have the environment to do that, and I can kind of set it and forget it, you know. But some stuff will only do it from leaf cuttings, and I've seen a lot of these on the internet done this way, where they have them in a vase like that, and then the new growth will actually come out under the water still. But that's about when you would want to put it in dirt, is once it's starting to try to grow. So the tangent that I'm going to go on is about rooting hormone. This is indole 3-butyric acid. This is not a naturally occurring plant hormone. This is the human synthetic version of that. A simple way of saying it is these are auxins. Auxins are the plant's hormone that it makes. It's not just for root development, just like none of your hormones are just for one thing. They're for multiple things. They contribute to a variety of things. So auxins are also used by the plant to keep it from rotting. So that's why I like to take this and put it in here. Because even though I have film in here, I'd probably still let this thing run for another month. And I might lose a couple of things to the biofilm and the rot, but some of this other stuff that roots really easily, it's not really going to affect it. It might be slimy when I pull it out, but it's going to have roots still. You'll see a lot of people on the internet, which is not a bad place to learn information. It's just you have to take that information and then apply it. It's unapplied research.
And some videos are just very dumb.
Yeah, and Jesus was right. Seek and ye shall find. If you want to find it, you can find it, whether it's right information or wrong information. So you have to put it into practice. So I take that as anecdotal evidence, and anecdotal evidence is still evidence, but it's anecdotal. I haven't put it to the test yet. But a lot of people will talk about rooting with willow water. Anyone read about willow water? Making willow water from weeping willows for rooting things? It can be done. It takes a long time to make good willow water. But the reason that it's good is because willow water is high in salicylic acid. The genus of willows is Salix. It's the Salix genus. So the weeping willow is Salix babylonica. It's so high in salicylic acid that it actually gives salicylic acid to plants that are growing within its root range. And salicylic acid is not a rooting hormone. That's what people will tell you if you're reading about willow water. They'll say, it replaces this. It's a rooting hormone. It's not a rooting hormone. Salicylic acid is the hormone that the plant has in highest concentrations in its seedling stage. So if I'm trying to trick this into thinking that it's a seedling, then I want to give it a bunch of seedling hormones. But the other thing that salicylic acid is used for is when a plant is attacked by a pathogen, not a bug, but a pathogen, fungus, bacteria, whatever, it releases salicylic acid as a response. It will communicate to other plants around it, hey, I'm being attacked, So they will boost their salicylic acid content in response to their nearby neighbor getting attacked. But it's a responsive thing. If I'm giving it salicylic acid, then it has a boosted immune system. So it's good for rooting things, but it's also good just all the time. And the best place to get it is aloe vera. Aloe vera is also high in salicylic acid. So I will take the aloe vera leaf. There's aloe in the propagation house that I use for propagation. I take the leaf, I cut it off, I squeeze a little jelly out into a ramekin, and I dip the cutting in it. And then I dip the cutting in rooting powder. The gel helps the rooting powder hold to the cutting so it doesn't just wash off. And it's taking up salicylic acid, which is what it puts out as a response to being attacked by a fungus, which would make it rot. So I'm boosting its immune system because it doesn't have an immune system without the root system. That's kind of my tangent solely because people will always bring up willow water when I'm talking about it, and there's just a way quicker way to do it. Don't make willow water. There's a reason weeping willows root really easily because they're always high in salicylic acid. You take the branches, stick them in the ground, they become a new tree. But you can get it from aloe vera. It's way easier. Don't put it in your water because it will break down and turn into rot. But if you're dipping cuttings and you're putting them in a media, if you have an aloe plant, that's the best way to do it. And you can cut the tip off and it'll still heal over so you don't like hurt your plant. But that was free information. Yes, sir.
So each plant, you can think of it as a kingdom. And the fungi is trying to go to war with each kingdom.
Now hold on, man. Now you're starting to go against my favorite thing. Because if you remember when she introduced me, my passion first and foremost was with soil ecology. And let me just tell you, there is an unnatural and unsubstantiated fear of fungus in the plant community. You, me, these plants would not exist on this planet without fungi. Fungi are gateway species to life. Very few of them are pathogenic, where they attack plants. Most of them help plants. They paved the way for plants to be here on this planet. So fungus is not necessarily a bad thing. I don't use fungicides because it hurts my soil ecology. Chances are the fungus that you see in your, I hear that all the time. People come into like a nursery. I got these mushrooms popping up all in my garden. How do I get rid of them? Wait 3 days, they'll be gone. And it's usually just a good sign that your garden is healthy.
We have squirrels and they've just gone in a day.
A good rule of thumb is if it's not on the plant, then it's probably fine. But what that is the fungus is really just, and this is totally not related to propagating, but the mushroom is just the flower of the fungus. The 90% of the fungus that we never see, the 90% of the iceberg that's under the water, looks like roots. It's called mycelium. And it literally taps into roots of other plants, and it acts as like an internet superhighway. So it will tell this plant, if there's mycelium under this whole room size, the plant that's over there is tapped into the same network. So if this plant gets attacked, that mycelium communicates to that plant over there that there's an attack going on over here and y'all need to prepare your defenses. It can also transport nitrogen from over here to that plant over there. It also holds water. It's the reason that nobody fertilizes the forest. Nobody has to go out there and throw osmocote beads down to keep the forest going. The forest has a system.
They communicate. They're like humans also.
Exactly. And the leaves every fall, they drop down. That's that layer that gets broken down by the fungus. Fungus typically breaks down brown manure, like wood chips, and then bacteria and other things typically break down green manure, which would be leaves and poop. But yeah, that's the simplest way of saying it is that nobody has to tend the forest. The forest has a system. It's been doing its thing for millions of years. It doesn't need your help. If anything, the grass is greener, where you're not messing it up. So just leave it alone. The best way to do that, and that's a whole different talk that I gave not too long ago to a different group on soil tilth. is to feed the beast the same way the forest does. Soil goes up, not down. Layer, layer, layer. Your mulch goes down. You ever notice that? You put mulch in your garden, and it's like 6 inches lower the next year. You never overfill your garden bed because you're just feeding it.
My mom
And
said,
slow breakdown.
so we sometimes plant things in pots to start it off. We had to go this far above it, my mom said, so that next year it will be fit. So if this is the brim of the pot, it will be the here.
Yeah, it'll definitely settle. And I'll also tell you, because I did medical cannabis, all medical cannabis has to be organic because it's used for medicinal purposes. So I'm not like an organic purist. That's just what I was professionally trained in. And so I know how to do it on a large scale. It's very difficult, and it takes a lot more work. But I will tell you that it's very hard to maintain healthy living soil in a container. Because healthy living soil needs access to constant moisture. The day that this goes dry is genocide. There's all the microbes, all the fungi, everything that's in here dies. It's not to say that it won't come back, it's just got to recolonize and it's got to rebuild all those numbers. So it's difficult to do that in a pot,
You lose all your
especially
money.
when it's a small pot. But it's still just difficult to do in a pot. That's why it's like, I still see people all the time. There's one of the guys, Lonnie, who works at the grounds. He was asking me if he could have a 45-gallon pot that was a black plastic pot that we had just gotten from a tree that they had just planted. And I was like, yeah, sure, you can have it, man. What do you want it for? And he's like, I'm going to grow some tomatoes in it. I was like, why? Put them in the ground, man. Like, they love clay. They love the constant access to moisture. And they do not do well in containers. But people always do certain things in containers, and you can, but it will always be better in the ground, unless it's like a cactus or something that doesn't want to be in the clay. And that's because if you're not spraying your yard with fungicides and tilling it and all that stuff, and you just have a natural layer, once it's tapped into that, it doesn't really need your help as much anymore, because then the mycelium is mitigating what the plant gets, because the mycelium feeds off of the plant eating. So it's beneficial for it to feed this thing so that it can also eat. But that's really more, and that's definitely another side tangent. But yeah, I'm definitely a big mushroom guy. So fungus is really, you should thank a fungi the next time you see it, because it's probably the only reason that you're here. And it's also, we're more closely related to fungi than any other kingdom. They exhale carbon dioxide and they inhale oxygen, just like we do. Any questions besides all of the good ones and the one from my former teacher, Miss Rubio? I don't know if y'all knew that. I went to Harding.
Other than, what are those pads called again?
Cloning collars.
Okay, thank you.
Like a collar on a shirt. Yeah, this is Easy Clone. If you look up a cloning reservoir on Amazon, there's probably 40 knockoffs. Buy the cheapest one, because there's really not a whole lot of difference between them, I'm sure. It's just a plastic bin. One thing I'm going to do to improve this one, it's the thing that drives me crazy, and it's because other people that I work with use this now, because they like it. That's the only reason, because it's not Sherry, but she knows. So I cleaned the bottom, but I didn't clean this top. By the way, this hasn't been running the whole time. When I unplugged it, nothing is drooping yet. It's because it's cooler in here. But see this right here? This scum? The design of this means that when I come through, and Jill has her lantana tree on a table right here, and it's like up here, and it's flowering and flowering and flowering, and it's dropping all those little pieces of the flowers. They fall in here, and then they collect on that rim. And that's where my biofilm comes from. Or these crispy leaves fall down like this one did right here, and I will come up across the top and I'll rinse it, but it just runs down into there. So one thing I'm going to do is make some kind of skirt or something that just hangs across the top. That's the only design flaw in this. But it would help me not have to change the water out. when we kept the water clean, when we were a little bit more diligent about it in Oregon, I went 4 months one time without ever changing the water out or cleaning this. Because if you don't put anything in the water, it should never have a reason to be dirty.
So basically, you gotta clean your plant first before you put it in the jar so it won't get.
Sort of, but like this lantana, if I leave this in here for another few weeks, those buds will eventually become flowers. And then all the little petals off the lantana flower will fall. So it's like, it's just kind of a practice in diligence and consistency that is difficult to do if you got a lot going on. So if you got a bunch of greenhouses and you got one of these sitting in a couple of different ones,
We don't have a green.
it's easy to, forget about stuff and then let it get dirty. But ideally, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, always. So trim it first, cut the flowers off first. Don't let people put their lantana trees on the table right next to it. But other than that, these I like because I don't like things that are analog. That's just, it's too much work. It's extra work. I can do things like that at my house because it's in front of my kitchen sink. And I'm gonna go to that kitchen sink at some point, every morning at least, to fill a coffee pot or something. And it's really easy for me to take the water in that coffee pot and just add a little bit to that base.
When
But
putting the.
I like the set it and forget it kind of stuff. It's really nice.
So putting the root powder or whatever the hormone in the water, would that be considered dirty water?
No.
Okay.
And those have auxins in them, so that's going to actually help prevent rot. And the whole reason that you put that powder on the cutting, Rick used to say this all the time, and it was just a minor disagreement that I had, but he would say, don't use so much rooting powder because it only gets taken through the tip, which was true. But if I take a knife and I take my semi-woody cutting and I just lightly scrape it, now if I stick 2 inches of that in the powder, whatever was exposed will take that powder up into it. And I prefer to have roots that come out from all sides of the stem, because then when I plant it, it's going to be able to support itself quicker than if it's a long cutting and they're just coming out the bottom. You don't have to rough up the stem on a lot of stuff, but the woodier it is, that bark is designed to not let things in. So like you have to kind of scrape at it and get to the pith just under it. But then that's what your petiole connections were for, where the leaves are. So wherever there was a leaf attachment, that's going to be a root now, and that's going to be where most of them come from. This one is lemon balm, and I know people are like, why the heck are you propagating lemon balm? It just grows everywhere.
It's amazing. It's
I
amazing.
needed some because I'm doing a cocktail class in August for herbs. So
Where's that?
It's here. I think they're selling tickets. The mixologists are coming from Memphis Whistle, and you get 2 free cocktails, and then you get to plant a planter box with herbs that are used in those cocktails. So I emailed those guys. I was like, hey, I could do this African blue basil. I could do lemon balm. Like, what else would y'all use in a cocktail? They gave me a list, and all those plants I could make. And so rather than buying them for this thing, which we're using to make money for the garden, I just got the list ahead of time. And so I was like, hey, I need lemon balm. And rather than start a bunch of lemon balm seed, I have a client that I do landscape design for. And he kind of likes the lemon balm, but once it's kind of been taking over the garden for the past 4 years, he's like, hey, can we start getting rid of this? And so I got rid of all of it, and I left one big patch. And he pointed it out a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, I'm saving that for cuttings, but I'll get rid of it when I'm done. And so I took cuttings for that cocktail class just for the lemon balm for these planter boxes. But this one is not trichome covered. This is very similar to the patchouli that I tried to root for Sherry, which does root, but it was just a little bit more difficult. It's smooth stemmed. The patchouli is, so is this lemon balm. Y'all can pass this around too. But I guarantee you'll see where I did it at the bottom. That's the part right here where the petioles were connected. That's the thick part. You could probably crush the stem. That's where the highest concentration of undifferentiated plant cells are. I'm mimicking and parroting that phrase because that's where I heard it on a YouTube video. This is where the roots are going to come out of. They will not come out of here. And if they do, it's going to take a lot longer. That's This is probably not the most ideal cut. These were just the 3 branches I bought. I like to do tops. This was the top, right? And if you start piecing it back together, this is all one stem. But this one is closer to the bottom, so it'll probably root first. This one's closer to the top. Probably take a little bit longer. This one will look like a plant quicker. This one will take a little bit of snipping and pruning to make it look like a plant. It kind of just depends on what you're going for. I need to make 75 of them between now and August 10th. So I got these going. The rosemary is super easy. I made a bunch for Sherry's garden this year. It's just a slow grower. So I'm going ahead and rooting it now so that it will look like a little Christmas tree by the time August is. But take your cutting based off of what your needs are. My way is not the way. It's just the way that I know. But I like to take them so that they look like a plant that would be commercially bought. This is for a planter class, so I wasn't super particular about how the plant looked. And then this is rosemary. These are from the parking lot. But you'll see where I roughed up the bark at the bottom. That's the wound that I put on it. So this was actually very bark covered because it was wood.
Sometimes you might want to put a wound on it.
Yeah, I scraped all that flesh off with my clean scissors.
And then the roots just come out with all the wood.
And then this is my nasty biofilm. If you have one of these, it's always good to get extra collars. I just got smart enough and did that not too long ago, so I have a brand new pack. So when I put a new cutting in, I put it in a clean one. I take the dirty one out, and I have a 5-gallon bucket of dirty collars. And then I'll pour rubbing alcohol in there, some hot water, soak it. And I can just keep that going instead of being like, well, I can't put new cuttings in here until I stop and clean this whole thing and scrub out all the cloning collars, because they open up. So they've got all those little nooks to clean out. So it's best to just soak them to where you can just blast them off with water after it's been breaking down. But that's just the stuff that after a while you start trying to figure out how you can make it more efficient. Anybody else got any questions? Y'all are free to come up here. This stuff, a lot of stuff that will root on the misting table, I rooted on the misting table. And that means I cut it and I just throw it in a pile.
What is the misting table?
It's a table in the greenhouse that has some misters hanging above it, and they're on a timer. And every 20 minutes it mists for
It's like at the produce
like
department.
2 or 3 minutes. Yep, just like the produce department.
Thank
But
you.
you guys can take some of these plants out if you want to. And the only other thing is the same stuff that would root like this on a misting table is the stuff that I just stick straight in dirt. So these are 2 coleus. I just filled the cells with dirt, but they're rooted and growing now. That was some rooting powder I just filled. This is the African blue basil. In the greenhouse, it loses a lot of the purpleness, and then as the days are getting longer, it'll actually start to come back out. Yeah. Your best bet is to take it and then immediately go put it in water and plant it. You can also take one of these that's not quite rooted yet, or is, and put it in water and finish it out. These take about 5 days in water without even changing the water out of it. This one's called Wild Magic. Yeah, this one's got a prettier flower, but it's very licoricey. This lady is the true nature of the basil plant. This one is also about 5 days. That's been in there for a while. So much so that you can see it's actually starting to grow upwards like the plant. That's how long it's been laying in the tray. This is the Wild Magic. This is the African blue basil. These are 2 hybrid basils, so they don't produce seeds. They can only be produced from cuttings, which means that whoever made this plant at the University of Connecticut, this plant is the same age as the original plant. It's all been ever produced from cuttings. These have the flower, and they keep producing their leaves, so you don't have to cut the flowers off. So you get a pollinator plant, and you get basil. It's kind of nice. That's good. That's one of those good problems, man.
Oh.
Bye, Sherry. And you'll notice on some of these, you might actually have roots like all the way up to the top. See, I got them up here. This is 2 plants. Just cut that. And now you got this bottom. But the longer they sit there, the worse they look. Sherry took these like, I don't know, last week. I mean, they were just starting to root. These are starting to look bad because they've been there like a month or so. But. Yeah. I mean, you can put these right here. So anything that's really hairy like that roots like this, I typically just root them in this. So I just stuck these in there and they're growing. This is called Hill Street. And that one I forgot, I think it's called Oxford Street, but it's a whole new Main Street variety. And the reason this one's cool is because it has the same growth pattern in full sun or full shade. They started making full sun coleus, and the full sun coleus in the shade, they get leggy. But these new varieties that they made, they grow the exact same in full sun or full shade. Leaf cutting? Try it. You can take it. I mean, it's like I made so many of those. That was just the representation. I had to try to remember not to pot everything up because I wanted to have some representative stuff for when I was here. This is called Wild Magic, but it's essentially just a hybrid blue basil. It is. These are only done through cutting. That one will flower, and it actually has coleus on landscape jobs. Drop seed and come back in a year. So it can reseed itself as an annual, but it's tropical trouble by the winter. It might reseed itself, it might not, but that's a great plant because it grows in full sun or full shade. Now you can take a cutting in the fall and root it in water and keep it alive at your house because it doesn't get a whole lot of sunlight, and then put it back outside the next year. So. This is the ham and eggs. Yeah, that was a little bit too tall to cut in, and so it's like touching the bottom. But yeah, these right here are all the ham and egg plantains. So if you want to pop one out, just take it. The rosemary is not ready, and I need that for a class, but for my cocktail.
Okay, the meeting is over, and that was a really good workshop. I always enjoy hearing him speak. Now I'm out at the car, and it is time to go home. I hope you each have enjoyed this workshop and learned some wonderful information as well as techniques. I hope everyone stays well, stays safe, keep your head on a swivel, stay safe out there, everyone. Keep on prepping. I look forward to seeing you in my next video, and may you each be blessed. I'll see you soon. Take care.